Space warps are non-renderable objects that create force fields to affect other objects. Space warps are specific for different types of objects. Geometry, for example, or splines or meshes have their own space warps. Particles have their own space warps. And then you can use modifier-based space warps to apply twist, bend, and your standard modifiers to large groups of objects. When you place a space warp in your scene, it creates an object, and you link your object, your space warp object, to your geometry or particles using the Bind to Space Warp button that we talked about in the interface section. In this simple scene, I have a particle system that we're going to apply a space warp to, and then we have these 4 spheres that we can apply a space warp to. To get access to the space warp tool, go to the Create panel and click on the Space Warp button. When you click on this button, you can see that the stack has different rollouts and that there's a pull-down menu to select different types of space warps. There are 3 kinds. Geometric deformable, which means that you can apply these to geometry or splines or meshes. Particles and dynamics, which you can apply to particle systems. And then modifier-based. The modifier-based space warps act like deformers that can let you bend, twist, taper, skew, noise, and stretch objects. You may ask, well, I can do that with deformers. Why would I need a space warp to do that? Well, you can use a space warp to bend, twist, taper, skew, noise, or stretch large numbers of objects at once, which is a very nice feature. And when you apply a space warp to an object, it puts it in the top of the modifier stack for that object or objects. So let's see how this works. Let's start by going to our geometric deformable, and let's select a number of objects here. And I'm going to group these spheres. Go to the Group menu, select Group, and click OK to make them a group of objects. Now I'm going to place a space warp. I'm going to place a wave space warp, and I can place it anywhere. And when I place it, I can change the nature of the space warp, and these are animatable over time. So now that I have a space warp in my scene, I have to link my space warp to my objects. Since this is a geometric deformable space warp, I want to link it to geometries or splines or a mesh, in this case this group of spheres. So what I do is I select the Bind to Space Warp tool, and I click on my space warp and drag, and when I get over an object I can link to that object or group of objects. And you can see that my spheres are changed by this. Now I go to my modifiers panel and I scroll down, and I can see that at the top of the modifier stack I have the wave space warp. And I can change the amplitude, and you can see my objects changing. Now since these objects are grouped, it affects the group. I can do this to individual objects, or I can just select a whole pile of objects and link them to a space warp. I can change the wavelength. I can change the phase. The decay. And notice that the position of the space warp, if I move this space warp, it's an object. And you can see that it has a sort of a force field, and you can affect your objects by moving the space warp closer to or away from the objects, or you can move the objects closer to and away from the space warp. You can see that it affects the objects depending on their position. And you can animate this, of course. So I can go to my first frame, click the Animate button, and then move the time forward, and then move the phase in the wave. When I turn off the animate button, I press play, and you can see that the space warp is now animated. Now I'm going to do the same thing but with my particle system. Since a particle system requires a different space warp, we have to create a new space warp under the Create panel, select Particles and Dynamics, and I'm going to use Wind, and I'm just going to place it in my scene like this. And you can see it has an arrow denoting its vector or the direction of the wind. And I can move this space warp around. Now I can link the space warp using the Bind to Space Warp tool to link the space warp to the particle system. And now you can see that the particles are affected by the space warp. I press play and I can see that the particle is being blown up by the space warp. And again, I can move the space warp to change its effect on the particles. I can rotate it, for example. And you can see it affects the particles accordingly. And finally, I can use a modifier-based space warp to modify groups of objects. So if I want to twist all of these spheres, or let's say I go to my Create panel and I create a bunch of spheres, I can modify these spheres, or whatever shapes I have, using the modifier-based space warp. So I can select a twist, for example. I'll place it in my scene. And it creates a cube. So anything that's inside this cube is going to be twisted or bent, or whatever the modifier is. So now I'm going to link this space warp to a bunch of different objects. And I'm going to change its parameters under the Modify panel. And you can see the objects that I've linked to it are being deformed. And I can move this space warp around to change the way it affects my objects. So to summarize, a space warp is a non-renderable object, meaning that if I place one on a scene and render it, you won't see it. But it is an object that creates a force field that affects objects that are linked to that space warp. If I select all these objects and delete them, I can start again and show you how to link an object to a space warp. First, you need an object, or objects. Then you need a space warp. Then you need to link your space warp to your objects. And then you have space warps affecting objects over time. There are 3 different types of space warps. Geometric deformable, which is for geometries, splines, and meshes. Particles and dynamics for particle systems. And then modifier-based, which essentially uses the basic modifiers bend, twist, taper, skew, noise, and stretch to apply these modifiers as a space warp to many objects at once.